I just finished harvesting some worm castings, and soon my garden will reap the benefits. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and I discuss everything gardening so that you can become a better gardener. Today, I'll cover all the steps for how to harvest worm castings. About 4 months ago, I started this worm farm in this single bin. And if you haven't seen that video, I'll be sure and put a link below to that one and another video that shows how I feed my worms. After all this time, now we can start harvesting the worm castings, because that's really the reason that I do this. I still have a couple sheets of newspaper across the top. This was put in place to help keep the moisture level constant, but it's definitely breaking down. The worms have started to eat the lower layer, and as it reveals what's underneath, I can see that the bedding and the food is almost completely eaten at this point. There are worms throughout. There's still a few chunky pieces, but for the most part, this is getting very close to being ready to harvest. Home worm farmers just have a few options when it comes to harvesting the worm castings. What you're trying to do is separate the worms from the castings. And this first method that I'll show you is called migration. The idea is to entice the worms away from the castings into another separate area of the bin. And I'll be reusing this bin once I get the castings out. The idea is in half the bed to put new bedding and new food, and eventually the worms will leave the castings that essentially has no more food in it and move into the new area where the new bed has been set up. I'll begin by removing rest of this top layer of newspaper. I can reuse it. And then I'm just going to take all these castings and move them to one half of the bed. And I can put this newspaper back down at the bottom. And so with all the castings on one side now, and all these worms active, I'll essentially create a whole second bed. So adding more moist shredded newspaper, I'll put it in the other half. So this is the bedding. And now I'll add some food to this, just as I did when I first set up the bed. And so I've got some pulverized vegetables, eggshells, some coffee grounds, some garden soil. And this is the enticement for the worms. I'll add a little bit more of the shredded newspaper on top. I can level this just a little bit. But now what should start happening is worms from this side, where there's less food, will start migrating to this side, where it's got more food and more area for the worms to start moving around in and repopulating. This takes quite a while. So I'm getting a start now just because it's a few weeks before I can expect the worms to really make noticeable movement. And now I'll just put the lid on and wait. The biggest advantage to using this type of migration to separate the worms from the castings is that the worms do all of the work. Now, I stopped feeding the worms a couple weeks ago so that they would focus on the castings and trying to get the last of the food and the last of the bedding eaten in those castings. There's still food there, and many of the worms will stay in the castings and continue to eat until the food is pretty much all gone. But some of the worms will start migrating, and eventually all of the worms will migrate. But that's going to take a couple weeks. I will wait 1 week, and then I'll show you another way that kind of uses migration, but makes it a little bit easier to make sure that all of the worms are out of the castings. So it's been about a week. Let's go ahead and take a look to see how many of our worms have decided to migrate. Looking in this paper, I can see quite a few. They're definitely starting to move across to this new bedding and this new food. To try to get a lot of the rest of the worms that are staying within the castings, I'm using a similar migration method, but this time I'm using a plastic container. This is an old sour cream container. And what I did is put holes into this container. There's a couple different ways you can do that. You can use a drill and drill some holes. But I find that this leaves ragged edges and it just doesn't work as well as a second method. If you feel comfortable around open flame, you can take a large screwdriver or nail, heat it over the flame, and then use that to poke holes into the plastic container. The holes are much smoother, and I find this to be a much easier and faster method. And then after all the holes are poked into the container, now it's time to fill it with some fresh bedding and some fresh food. I just used the same wet newspaper and some pulverized and blended vegetables. And then when all that's done, this is ready to put into the castings to try to draw out a lot of those worms. They'll crawl through the holes and into this container with its bedding and food. So what I do is just dig out the center of the castings, a space big enough to just drop this all the way in. And then I'll spread the castings around this container and let the worms decide whether they want to continue eating what's left in the castings, go into this container, or move over to the fresh side of the bed. I'm not going to add any more food to the casting side of this bin, but on the fresh side, I'm going to treat it as though it's a brand new worm bin. And so as I have the vegetables that I've blended up, I'll add them to the side with the shredded newspaper. And after all the food is in place, just like in previous beds, I'll go ahead and cover this with some more wet shredded newspaper. And so now this is ready for the worms to move. And I'm going to give them a couple weeks. I'll check again after a week and then after 2. And if it looks like the castings are mostly free of worms, I'll move to the next step. So for now, just going to let the worms be worms. It's been another week. Let's see how the worms have migrated. In this area right here, oh yeah, there's a lot of good worms. Looks like they're starting to move very well. So that's working. Let's look inside our container. We have a couple worms, just a couple, but that's okay. We'll leave that going. And then let's look in the castings. I don't really see much worm activity. There are just a couple remaining. Not many. So we're getting very close. I think we've got most of the worms that have migrated. We'll give it a couple more days and then we'll be ready to move to the next step. It's been 5 months since I first started this bin, and it's been 3 weeks since I started the migration process. I said that the migration was easy, and I really haven't done much in those 3 weeks other than just check on the status. There is another way that you can separate the worms from the castings, and that's to use light, because worms don't like light. So if you keep the top off and have a bright light shining in the bin, then you can come in and scrape off that top inch or so of castings. And there shouldn't be many worms in that. And then the next day you come back and you do another inch or so of the castings, because the light will continue to drive the worms further down. Well, that works, and I've actually been doing that for the last couple days. I've had this top off with some light on just to ensure the worms continue to separate. The biggest issue I have with using the light method, it is a little bit more work, but what happens is you end up with a really thick layer of worms at the bottom, and those worms will be in the castings. And so it requires another method to either separate the worms from the castings, or you add more bedding and you're left with that layer of castings at the bottom. But it is an alternative. Today, I'm ready to completely harvest the castings, and I'll show you another method, a method that I use to separate out any individual worms, but also a completely separate method that you could use from the very beginning. And so the worms should be mostly separated. I'll go ahead and remove this little container. Doesn't really look like there's many more worms in it. I'll set it to the side. And now I'll just start scooping the castings into a separate container. And I can see that there's quite a few worms in here. If I had allowed the migration to continue, they might have separated some more. But that's why I move on to this next step, to do what I can to separate the worms from the castings. For this next option in separating the worms from the castings, I use a piece of hardware cloth. This is 1/2 inch hardware cloth. And I just place it on top of a bowl. I take some of the castings and I'll just rub them across this hardware cloth. Now, most of the worms are gone at this point, but particularly the bigger worms will be real easy to pick out from this surface. This is also a good way to get rid of any twigs, pieces of leaves and newspaper that haven't fully been eaten by the worms. And you should be left with a pretty good ratio of nothing but castings. Now, you can do this from the very beginning. You don't have to go through the migration method. You don't have to use the light method. The biggest issue I have with this is when you're doing this and rubbing the castings across this screen, when there are worms, you could damage the worms. And I like to treat my worms as nicely as possible. So this is very effective. It does take a little bit of effort. And I use this to finish off the separation rather than to start the separation. As I move the castings over the hardware cloth, I'll look for little worms before they fall through, and I'll continue to throw newspaper bits and twigs into this other bowl. I've gone ahead and put some wet newspaper bedding in this separate bowl, so if I do find any worms that go into that bowl, they'll be able to escape the light. And then I'll just continue this process. When I find big chunks that might have been at the bottom that haven't been eaten yet, I'll remove them, because I'm really trying to get just the castings at this point. Along the way, look for the worm eggs or cocoons. They're really small. They're kind of egg-shaped. They're the color of honey, and inside each of these little cocoons, little live earthworms will emerge. So if you can remove these at this point and then go ahead and add them to your new bed, you've got another generation all ready to go. And when you're done with the separation, you're left with wonderful worm castings. And these can be used right away. In my next video in this series, I'll show you how I use worm castings in the garden. But I don't use them right away because a number of eggs are still in here. And there's some little tiny worms that are probably still in here as well. None of those methods will really prevent that from happening because those little tiny worms aren't going to migrate, and the eggs are going to be sifted into this finished material. So I'll leave this moist. It's still alive. There's lots of beneficial bacteria in addition to the worms. So I'll put this in another bin, keep it moist, and I'll actually put a little bit of food and bedding off to the side just to allow any larger worms and maybe those little worms as they grow to migrate out. And I'll come back and sift it again, go through it to try to find any remaining eggs or any remaining worms that might be in here, and then I'll use it. And you can keep the moist castings for a few months without any problems. I usually use it by then, but as long as it doesn't dry out, it won't kill any of the material or any of the living things that are in here. Now, as for the worms that I separated and the eggs, this is a really good opportunity to start a second bin. During the migration, in that first bin, I've got a whole bunch of worms. But I've got enough to start a whole second bin. And I've already done that using it in the first video. I've got it prepared, ready to go, and I'll just dump these eggs and worms into that bin, and then I've essentially doubled my population. And next time, I'll have 2 bins worth of worm castings to separate. If you missed the earlier videos in this series, go ahead and click right here, and that'll take you right to the videos that you missed. And if you have any comments or questions, please let me know below. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and share it with others who might be interested. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.